Welcome everybody. It's great that you could be here. Most of you have participated in the past as sponsors for the Beit Midrash. So let me take this opportunity to thank you for your support in the past and thank you for your support this year again. The entire budget of the Beit Midrash is funded by the sponsors. So, Emen, Kemach and Torah, without the support there wouldn't be the Torah. You have supplied that. Let me start by welcoming and thanking the principal of Libla Yavna College, Shula, Mora Shula, and Rabbi Chaim for their wholehearted support of everything that we do. Welcome President Benji Djokovic. I'll bring you apologies from Rabbi Kimchi, who unfortunately couldn't be here. He'd committed to be a Masada Kedushin, I think today, and other things that he was managing, so he couldn't be here. And Mirz Hashem, he'll be with us next year when we proceed with supporting the Beit Midrash. I welcome Reb Lior from Beit Haroeh, Rabbi Kennard from the Ashkama Minyan, Rav Chezi from KOD, Rav Johnny from the Beit Midrash, and Rav Shua Solomon, who came from Sydney. Bruchim Abayim. Ladies and gentlemen, you're all aware that it's the 25th anniversary because it was on the invitation. But in addition to that, it's also 80 years since the establishment of Mizrachi in Melbourne, in Australia, in 1943. Ben Shmonim Ligvura. There's a great strength associated with attaining 80 years, and Mizrachi has just grown from strength to strength. And that notwithstanding the fact that most of us have got our children, our siblings, parents, family in Medinat Yisrael, it would be fair to say that at least a half of our community has made Aliyah. And yet, all the things that Rav Doron mentioned in his speech in Mizrachi on Shabbos about the leadership of Mizrachi in providing so many things for the entire community have just grown from strength to strength. It's my pleasure to welcome Ambassador Mark Regev to join us tonight, and Rav Doron Perez, and I'll speak a little bit more about them in a moment. Now, many of you wouldn't know that today is a special anniversary as well. It's the 20-year anniversary of my daughter's graduation from Mount Scopus. Sorry, that's where I went. Sorry. Rav Kennard, that's a point for me. Okay. And this morning at the college celebrated the 20-year anniversary. Sorry, Shula, excuse me. Sorry, Shula. Of Libla Yavna College. And David Fisher took the opportunity to include a photograph on the front page of Kesher of the graduates of the 20-year ago matric, including Kara and the children of many other people here. And I won't sing you about Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, but that's how we started. But he continued on to talk about connectedness. It was a great piece. I urge you to read it. School connectedness is particularly important for young people who are at increased risk for feeling alienated or isolated from others, That is why Yavne invests so heavily in supporting students to feel part of the family. And that continues on. And it's part of our Mizrachi approach. The chut mishulash b'mheira lo yenatek. The three-plied cord will not easily be severed. We bring together Mizrachi, we bring together Yavne, we bring together Bnei Akiva, and all of them are supported by the activities of the Beit Midrash. Mizrachi is a worldwide institution. We provide you with the HaMizrachi magazine almost on a monthly basis. The Mizrachi Parasha Weekly comes out weekly. Mizrachi provides a newsletter with current material and Divrei Torah. It's all there for you. All you have to do is take it and read it. It comes online and it's supplied at the organisation. I want to take the opportunity, in addition to thanking all of you as sponsors, to particularly thank our platinum sponsors, Robbie and Debbie Nussbaum. Now, the signage hasn't yet gone up at Mizrachi for the people who have contributed to the construction of the wall and the entrance. I'm thinking of the Scher family and the Lamb family and the Nussbaum family and Hirschbergs and Menahams all played a part in all of that, but that will all happen in time. 25 years of the Beit Midrash has made a tremendous contribution, not only to Mizrachi, but to the whole community. And on the back of the list that was placed around the tables, you could see the list of Rashi Kollel, the Bachurim, the Banot, that will be available in the foyer of Mizrachi, reference to Dr. Michael Kaufman, and particularly, of course, reference to our current Rosh Kollel, Rav Johnny Brule. V'rayato Shira. There are certain people who have made this thing happen in the way that it has. Now, Ray, I heard that you're starting your 18th year this year at Mizrachi. That's a pretty good innings. Ken Yerbal. Ray's been working pretty hard. It just so happens that all this coincides with preparation for Yom Noraim and seats in the shul and so on. You'll be interested to know that we're sold out in the shuls, and I imagine the same thing will happen in Beit Haroeh, and I'm hopeful that in KOD the same thing will happen. So thank you, Ray, for your work. Thank you, Ari Fisher, for your contribution, to David Fisher as always, and to Shoshi and Lazar for their terrific catering. It's now my pleasure to welcome our keynote speakers. Rav Johnny will be moderating the session. He's been with us for 2 years and now commences the 3rd year. There's a terrific group of boys coming. You'll get an opportunity to see them in a moment. We welcome Ambassador Mark Regev. Now, Mark told me this was like home away from home. Half his Mount Scopus graduate year were here with him from the same year. He's been a terrific advocate for Israel. He's a great spokesman for Prime Minister Bibi and Ambassador to the Court of St. James. And we discussed his activities there, how he set out to meet as wide a section of the community as possible and not just sit in a particular location and wait for people to come to him. During the time that I was president of the Executive Council of Australian Jury, and during the time I was president of the Zionist Federation, I reached out to Mark several times, and he facilitated important meetings for me, particularly with the Prime Minister, with Bibi at the time. So thank you, Mark. Mazel tov on the family simcha that you were here for. Mazel tov on your mum's 90th birthday, Ad Mea V'Esrim. We welcome Rav Doron Perez. Rav Doron and I go back about 15 years, perhaps more. I visited him in Johannesburg. He visited me in Melbourne. I can tell you that I was part of the selection process for your appointment as Executive Chairman of the World Mizrachi. Rav Doron has invigorated the activities of World Mizrachi. It's not the moment for me to go into all the details of all the things that have been done. It's all readily available for you to find. But he's done a fantastic job, and he provides a tremendous energy. For us, we've got more than just Rav Doron as a connection, because Rav Danny is his Deputy CEO. So when I come there, and if any of you come there, you'll get the most warm welcome at Beit Meir, and you'll be able to visit the offices of Bnei Akiva, of Torah Mitzion, of Mizrachi, and see the range of activities that take place. I'd now like to call on Ari. For those of you who don't have family in Israel, that's your new family. And that has been the way it's been for many of our kids over many years, that when they haven't had family, the Tsevet have been the family for them. Well, we couldn't quite get the Chafifah right. They finish after Tisha B'Av. The next group doesn't start till Elul. But there is a new group coming. Ari, can we see who they are, please?
Excellent job, everyone.
Pretty Labour Deck. I'd just like to finish off by extending thanks to Zev Schwartz, who runs Kol Torah Mitzion, and has been doing that for the whole time. He's done a fantastic job. And one of the people that work for him most of the time is Rabbanet Chassida Pinchuk. She just recently finished her term there, but we want to thank them both and the whole Tsevet for everything they do for us. Without any further ado, I'd like to call on Rav Johnny to speak to us. Thank you.
Erev Tov. It is an honor to address you as we draw near to the completion of 2 years of Shlichut in this wonderful community, which we've come to call our home away from home. We're truly blessed to be part of such a kehillah. Though the distance from here to Eretz HaKodesh is great, this community's love of Torah and love for Israel is equally great. Chazal, at the start of Masechet Ta'anit, comment on the pasuk, Le'ahava et Hashem Elokeichem ul'ovdo b'chol levavchem. To love Hashem your God and to serve Him with all your heart. Chazal ask, what is this avodah shebelev, service of the heart? They answer, Zot tefillah. Service of the heart means tefillah, prayer. However, the Midrash in the Sifrei brings an alternative explanation. Zet Talmud. Service of the heart refers not to tefillah, but to Talmud, to Torah study. And yet Chazal go further and claim, Ukshem she'avodat mizbeach kruya avodah, kach Talmud kruya avodah. Torah study is not just compared to service of the heart, but to avodat mizbeach, the temple service on the mizbeach itself. Torah and the Mikdash are inherently linked. It is in this sense that Yeshayahu Hanavi proclaimed, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah udvar Hashem Yerushalayim. Tzion, Yerushalayim, and Israel are the source from which Torah emanates and upon whose mizbeach we dedicate ourselves to Dvar Hashem. We're so grateful to be teaching Torah in this community. The Tsevet who we bring out each year are vital role models to the young people of this community at Mizrachi, Bnei Akiva, and at Libra Yavna College in exemplifying what it means to be a true religious Zionist Jew. Their chavrutot and chaburot, both in the school and in the Beit Midrash at Mizrachi, are fulfilling that mission of Ki Mitzion Tetzei Torah. On a personal note, it is truly a joy to learn and teach Torah here. Pikudei Hashem Yisharim Mesamchei Lev. The ordinances of Hashem are just, rejoicing the heart. From the 40 or so women who learn with me in the ever-growing Monday morning shiur, through to my dear students from the B'nai, Or David, and Yavna communities, to the 30-odd professionals who attend Lunch and Learn in the city and Lunch and Learn at Mizrachi, and the various balabatim of the community in the Tzurba, Gemara, Parasha, and Halacha shiurim throughout the week, I hope that you are enjoying the Torah that we learn together. For Shira and me, this shlichut has been about reaching beyond the four walls of the Beit Midrash as well. On Shabbat, we read that when helping someone out, the guiding principle must always be Hakem Takim Imo. You must establish together, Imo, with him, to build together, to meet the other person where they are at. In an ever-changing community and ever-changing world, we aspire to do just that. We see giving drashot in shul, answering tens of she'elot each week, hosting large meals on Shabbat for young people, and connecting with the community, young and old, as an integral part of what we are doing here. Reaching people, not just in the formal setting of the Beit Midrash, but throughout the Kehillah, continues to be an important focus for us moving forward in our spreading of Torat Zion and Ahavat Zion throughout the Mizrachi community. Before we move on to the next part of the evening, our discussion about Israel, I'd like to briefly thank a few people. Firstly, thank you to Dr. Danny Lamb for meeting with us almost 4 years ago in Israel and securing us into this shlichut, and for your continued support over the years. To our Rosh Midrashah, Dr. Michal Kaufman, whose passion for Torah and warm counsel have always been invaluable. To our Beit Midrash chairman, Alan Lotzov, for his tireless efforts behind the scenes in managing the arrival and welfare of the new Tzevet each year. We look forward to the arrival of our new Bachurim in just under 2 weeks' time. To our new Mizrachi president, Benji Jotkowitz, and his team, and to Ray Bauer at the Mizrachi office for their continued support in our shlichut and for everything that they do for this community. And to my dear wife, Shira, for allowing all of this to be possible. For the long nights I'm in the Beit Midrash and full days immersed in preparing shiurim, drashot, and answering she'elot. For the tens of people you have hosted in our home on Shabbatot. For being an incredible wife and mother. Shali v'shelachem shelahu. And achron chaviv, thank you to all of you. Lomdei haTorah v'tomcheha, those who study Torah and support it. Etz chaim hi lemachazikim ba v'tomcheha me'ushar. Torah is a tree of life for those who grasp it. V'tomcheha, and may those who support it only know happiness. Tonight we'll be speaking about Israel and touching upon questions as to the very nature of the Jewish state. We stand here between Parsha Ki Teitzei and Parsha Ki Tavo. On the one hand, Israel has challenges of Ki Teitzei. Ki Teitzei la milchama olayvecha. Medinat Yisrael has known enemies and ill wishers. And on the other hand, there are the challenges of Ki Tavo. V'haya ki tavo el haaretz. V'yirishta v'yashavta ba. Israel seeks to prosper on the land and to achieve internal peace. We hope and pray that, despite the challenges that Israel faces, she continues to flourish and merits the bracha from this week's parasha, Baruch atah b'voecha u'baruch atah b'tzeitecha, to be blessed on all fronts, that of Ki Teitzei and that of Ki Tavo. In a few moments, I'll be asking our esteemed guests, Ambassador Regev and Rav Perez, some pre-selected questions about Israel, followed by questions from the audience. But first, we will hear some opening remarks from Ambassador Regev, followed by Rav Perez about Israel today. Ambassador Regev, b'vakasha.
Erev Tov, good evening. It's my pleasure to be here, and I was very pleasantly surprised when during the cocktail part of our evening, that I met 4 women who were in my high school, and I don't think I'd seen them for, where are you? Oh, there, yes. I don't think I'd seen them for I don't want to say how many years, that's not polite, correct? Look, a lot of the news coming out of Israel over the last couple of months hasn't been good, and let's be frank. You can sit here in Melbourne and maybe even get a touch depressed. If you look at what's going on in violence with our neighbors, unfortunately we've had a terror attack and some more. And it's, not terribly exciting and not terribly, something that you can be happy about. On the contrary. And all this is happening at a time when the internal divide in Israel has unfortunately become even stronger. And many people fear for the future of the state. As we know in our tradition, when Jews argue with Jews, we're good at arguing with each other, but when argument turns into hatred, heaven forbid, then you're really going down the wrong corridor. So I thought, if I'm speaking at Mizrachi, I should try to bring some good news. And not just talk about what's going wrong, but maybe talk a bit about something that could be very exciting and actually change the whole picture in a positive direction. And I don't know if any of you read me every week in the Jerusalem Post, but I wrote 2 weeks ago a column where I pointed to something that's going on at the moment, which if it happens, and I think there's a reasonable chance it could happen, is a game changer. And that is the possibility of a peace breakthrough with Saudi Arabia. And the fact that there's been nothing in the newspapers over the last few days, for someone like me who's been in the Israeli government and the high levels of Israeli government and see how the game's played, the fact that it's not being talked about and it's not in the newspapers over the last 2 weeks, that's actually a sign that maybe something serious is going on. Now, when it comes to international relations and peace agreements, I'd like to tell you that people do things because they have moral instincts, and people do things because it's the right thing to do and they want a better world. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's not true. In my experience, people do things in international relations because they pursue their own interests. And I think the chance of peace with Saudi Arabia is possible, maybe even probable, precisely because everyone is doing things in their own interests, and there's a convergence of interests between the three relevant parties. You have a president in Washington who's running for re-election, and he would love to have an Israel-Saudi peace treaty before November next year for obvious reasons. His predecessor had the Abraham Accords. He wants something bigger. And a peace treaty between Israel and Saudi Arabia would be a huge event. Saudi Arabia has a special status in the Arab world. It has a special status in the Islamic world. And if the Saudis were to make peace with Israel, I think it's fair to presume that a whole series of Arab countries that up until now have been sitting on the fence could well follow the Saudi example. And more importantly for you as Australians, the Saudis have a leadership role in a 57-member organization of Islamic cooperation. So take away the 20 Arab countries, there's still 37 Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries, many of whom do not have relations with Israel. 2 of them are immediate neighbors of Australia. And maybe one of those 2 would follow the Saudi example and also make relations with Israel if the Saudis would do it first. If the Saudis make relations, it's a game changer. Others will follow. I'm not a rabbi, I don't pretend to be knowledgeable about Talmud and Halakha, as my close friends will tell you. But it would be, if the Saudis make peace with Israel, it's like a hechsher, like it's kosher for people in the Islamic world to talk to Israel. Now, Biden wants the deal for political reasons, but the national security establishment in the United States want it as well, because Saudi-US relations have not been in a good place over the last couple of years, ever since Biden spoke about the Khashoggi business and said we have to make Saudi Arabia a pariah state. And the idea that you would upgrade, because the deal is that the Saudis make peace with Israel and the Americans sign a formal NATO-type defense agreement with the Saudis, which the Saudis have always wanted. And so it's good for the Americans. I said, once again, in the real world that I know, people do things because it's in their interest. The Americans have every interest to try to push this in the next couple of months. Why is it good for the Saudis? The Saudis have for years wanted a formal defense arrangement with the Americans. For years. And the Saudis know that the only country that will come to their defense if attacked is the United States, and over the last couple of years they've been less sure of American protection. And if the Saudi leadership believes that there's a window of opportunity, Biden wants a deal and he wants it now, and that window will close after November next year, they might feel it's now the time to get the deal. They might feel that this is a window of opportunity. They might feel that this is now something that just can't be put away. The Saudis want that formal defense treaty with the United States, and the Saudis also wanted the access to all this top-gear American military equipment that up until now they haven't been allowed to get, and they think if they get the deal, they get the military equipment. There are some problems there for Israel, but I don't think there's anything that is unsolvable. So the Saudis sense that the Americans are putting something on the table that they've wanted for generations, I'm exaggerating, for decades, and it might not be in the table by the end of next year. Now is the time to go for it. And for Israel, it's almost a no-brainer. Saudi Arabia would be a game changer, as I said, with the Arab world, with the larger Islamic world. Netanyahu has publicly spoken a number of times that a peace treaty with Saudi Arabia is one of the goals of this government. Instead of being Mr. Netanyahu, who's divided the country, judicial reform, he becomes Netanyahu, the peacemaker. He does a Begin. It's a big deal. He's suddenly back in square one where he wants to be, the statesman, the leader. And it might be politically good for him too, like Mr. Biden. And all politicians want to get re-elected. So I think, not because, once again, people want to see peace in the Middle East, but for everyone's own reason, this can work. The Americans want it, the Saudis want it, the Israelis want it, and it can happen. I can see problems, I can see reasons why it won't happen. But today, when I look at the realities of what's going on in Washington, Riyadh, and Jerusalem, I see a convergence of interests that could make this happen. We already know that the Saudis, according to the press, I can't confirm, have had secret meetings with the Israelis. We already know that when you fly from Israel on an El Al liner that takes off from Tel Aviv, you fly over Saudi airspace. I'm sure a lot of you have already done that. We couldn't do it 2 years ago, we can do it today. We already know that the Saudis don't like the same people we don't like. The Saudis don't like the Iranians. The Saudis don't like Islamic Jihad. The Saudis don't like Al-Qaeda, and they don't like ISIS. They don't like the extremism. We know the Saudis, for all their faults, and they have them, they're ultimately pro-Western and pro-American. They're also in the American-Western defense arrangement. If we can make peace with them, it's a breakthrough. And I think it's probable. And if it does happen, it'll put a lot of the other stuff we're going through recently into perspective, and we can be hopeful and confident about the future. There will have to be, I believe, the Palestinian issue has to be dealt with in some way. In the past, the Saudis used to say, we're not going to have normalization with Israel until there's a Palestinian state on the West Bank, on the 67 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital. That was the Saudi official position. That's called the Arab Peace Agenda, the Arab Peace Plan. But the Saudis are no longer there. That might have been true 10 years ago. It was definitely true 20 years ago. It's not true anymore. But there might have to be a fig leaf. There might have to be a fig leaf for the Palestinians in the arrangement, and I believe Netanyahu can do that. I think for Saudi, he'd be willing to pay, give them a fig leaf. I'm not sure all his coalition partners will be ready for that fig leaf, but ultimately peace with Saudi Arabia, I think, would help Netanyahu politically and not hurt him. And if all his coalition partners couldn't live with it, I think he could still do very well politically without them. in that sort of constellation. So it will not only affect the region and the way the Arab and Islamic world looks at Israel, it could have a dynamic effect on Israel itself. But I'm happy to discuss this more and anything else when we talk later. I thank you all very much.
B'chvod Achsanya, I stood here on Friday speaking to the grade 11s and 12s, and it's an honor to be back at the Liebler Yavne College, Mora Schuller, Rabbi Cowan, and all the wonderful staff of the college, Rabbanim Chashuvim, Melbourne, Rabbi Brill, the Rosh Kollel, and our moderator, and all the Rabbanim from Melbourne, my friend Rabbi Shua Solomon, who's come from Sydney. I'm going to Sydney tomorrow. He made sure that he's not in Sydney when I'm there. Well done, Rav Shua. Thank you for being here for this wonderful evening and all the work you do for Mizrachi in Sydney. The committee of Mizrachi, President Benji Djokovic and the whole committee, immediate past presidents David Brickman and the entire committee, which we look so forward as we have all of the years to continue to work together to build on our wonderful relationship. Danny and Rolene Lamb, as Danny said, I think it's more than 15 years, but Danny was on the search committee, and we work very closely together as the Vice President of World Mizrachi for all the work you've done here over decades and for World Mizrachi for decades now as well. Rafi and Eliza Lamb, Rafi's on our board and does so much for Mizrachi, for World Mizrachi. And all of you here today really celebrating 80 years of Mizrachi Melbourne. As I said in Shul, I have to repeat it briefly, it is really unusual that there is a community like this. It's unparalleled to any other Mizrachi around the world, where the Mizrachi organization of Melbourne runs an important national kashrut division. The Eruv in Melbourne, involved in the Beit, has such a wonderful shul community with so many minyanim. Wonderful Beit Midrash, the Midrash for women, the Beit Midrash for men that we're celebrating 25 years today for this wonderful event. Such an incredible school, the Liebler Yavne College. To have all of this under one rubric is a remarkable achievement. And shkoyach for 80 years, not only add 120, far beyond, to continue to serve this wonderful community. So we're here also for 80 years of Mizrachi, 25 years for the Beit Midrash, but I understood that we're really here to celebrate Kara's 20th graduation from Liebler Yavne College and Ray's 18th anniversary here at Mizrachi. That I didn't know before, but now I do. And of course, it's an unbelievable privilege for me to share this platform with Ambassador Mark Regev. I am one of those people who read you every week, and I've noticed a very positive tone the last number of weeks particularly. And thank you for the wonderful work you have done. I mean, who am I to thank you? But shkoyach for really the incredible work that you've done across governments, which is a big achievement, and an official ambassador of the State of Israel in the UK, and such an articulate, one of the finest sons of Australian Jewry to represent Israel in this way. It's an honor to share this platform with you. I want to talk about one word. This whole next few minutes that I have is really about one incredible Hebrew word, and that word is mashber, crisis. We are going through a major crisis in Israel, as you all know, and as we'll speak about in the moments ahead. It's a tremendous mashber. I don't know if in recent history has the Israeli army ever been brought so centrally into Israeli politics. Not getting involved right now, right or wrong. It has huge ramifications. Thankfully, it's not the standing army. Thankfully, it's not the permanent force. I'm very privileged to have two sons in Israel's permanent force officers. But it is affecting the reserve force in significant ways, Israel's economy, and bringing things that one would have thought were part of Israel's consensus into the political fray. Some real challenges that this judicial reform that we'll speak about has brought out at the core of Israeli society. It's a mashber. as I was writing the epilogue of the book that I was very privileged, I also want to thank the Teller family. I'm staying at the Tellers. When I normally come to Melbourne, I stay at the Seagulls. Sam and Judy aren't here. I thank Daniel and Amanda always for their hospitality. It was lovely to be with them. I just want to say that when I was writing the epilogue of the book, it was in January 2023, and they just announced the judicial reform. And in the epilogue, I managed to slip something, and I want to share with you. Ambassador Reg will be very familiar with this. Some of you here will be familiar with it because it's been spoken a lot about in Israel in recent months. My son, during his officer training, had a certain speaker who came to speak that I'd never heard of. His name is Nathaniel Ellenson. He's the head of a mechina in Israel. And he wrote a book 2 years ago called Kitzur Toldot HaYisraeliyut, a short history of Israelism. And my son told me about what he said, and I was blown away by what he said. I then went and I bought the book. And I want to share with you his thesis, and I write about it in the epilogue of the book. He says, and I'm sure some of you have heard of this, and it's quite harrowing, and it was very uncomfortable to read. He said, Israel, both in its first commonwealth in King David's time and second commonwealth in the times of the Hashmonaim, unraveled in the 73rd year. The 8th decade is always challenging. King David was appointed king in Jerusalem for 33 years, 7 years before in Hebron. 40 years Solomon ruled, and in the 73rd, 33 plus 40, what happened? The kingdom was split. Rechavam, Yerovam. The kingdom split tragically into two different states. The state of Israel in the north and Mamlechet Yehuda in the south. And so much tragedy, the 10 lost tribes and other things happened as a result of that. Then he says the same thing happened in the times of the Hashmonaim. In the time of Shimon HaChashmonai, the only one of the 5 sons of Yehuda of Matityahu, Kohen Gadol, to survive the war, he became king and established the Hashmonai, the Hasmonean. And then his son Yochanan, Kohen Gadol, ruled. Then his son Yanai, and in the era of Yanai, his 2 sons Aristobulus and Hyrcanus were having an internal debate of who should be king. The one reached out to Pompey as Rome was an ascending empire, brought the Romans into Israel, and bringing the Romans and giving them a foothold in Israel at the time, in Judea at the time, eventually brought about the destruction of the temple. And maintains Ellenson, we seem to, excuse the expression, mess it up in the 8th decade. And he has a thesis. He says the first generation, he calls them Dor HaMeyasdim, the founders. They, the founding generation, sweat and toil, who didn't have a state before and they rebuild it. The second generation is called Dor HaBonim, those which build on the achievements of the founding generation and knew them. And then the third generation he harshly calls Dor HaHorsim, those which destroy. They don't remember the founders. They take things for granted. Vayishman, Yeshurun, Vayivat. Things are the way they're supposed to be. They don't know the challenges and travails of building a country from scratch and building it and sustaining it. They haven't fought any major wars as the founding generations and fought over the first 25 years. And we have to be very careful that that doesn't repeat itself. I'm very confident and believe, as Ambassador Regev does, with tremendous positivity. As a politician, Ram Emanuel, once said, never ever waste a good crisis. When a crisis comes in your life, don't waste it. It's there to unravel and to bring you to a greater level of consciousness, and hopefully for the Jewish people. And the truth is, the word mashber is a fascinating word. Firstly, it's built on the root word shever, to be broken. And therefore, lishbor, we break things. Shever is brokenness. But shever is also prosperity. The mashbir in Yerushalayim, Joseph is called 10 times the Mashbir. Let's go to Egypt, says Yaakov, Lishbor Shever, right? What is Lishbor Shever? It's not to break bones. It's to go and find sustenance in times of famine. The word Lishbor doesn't only mean to break, and it doesn't mean just to go buy grain. It means to go acquire grain at a time of crisis, a time of famine, a time of desolation. There's an oasis of hope always. There's shever everywhere. Everyone around you is broken. But there's also shever, mashbir. There's an opportunity to provide sustenance, to provide hope. And that is really what shever is. It's not only brokenness, but it's the Jewish way of saying within the challenge and the famine is always the opportunity for hope and oasis of prosperity. And all of you, I'm sure here, know that the word mashber in the Torah, in Tanakh, is not only a crisis as it's become, but of course, it's the birth stool where a woman gives birth who, if anybody was watching what was happening, not knowing with all the blood and the pangs and the pain and the difficulty and the challenge, out of that comes life and comes a child, b'damayich chayin. Therefore, a mashber is an opportunity for growth. And Bezrat Hashem, that will come out of this deeper understanding. It will require a lot of humility, but Bezrat Hashem, we'll get there. As they say, as we say in Israel, Ein lanu eretz acheret. There's no other land that the Jewish people have ever called their own as a people. Ein breira. We have to get it right because this is the only country which is ours. And famously, Chief Rabbi Herzog famously said only he could have said something like this with such confidence. When Rommel was approaching Palestine in the 1940s, and it really looked that, God forbid, it would be the end of the Yishuv, people came to him and said, it's time to clear out the Yishuv. What you're going to risk, the whole Yishuv getting destroyed by Erwin Rommel, and everyone knew who Erwin Rommel was, the Desert Fox. And Rabbi Herzog said, without batting an eyelid, there will not be a third Khurban. The Jewish people have begun returning en masse. Yes, there isn't a Beit HaMikdash, but hundreds of thousands of Jews have returned in unparalleled ways. When that starts, we have a tradition that there is no other nivuot of, nowhere does it say in the prophecies that the Jews will return a third time and then get destroyed and come back. And of course, none of us are prophets, and only Rabbi Herzog could say such a thing with confidence, believing that the kibbutz galiyot, imagine if that was said then in the 1940s, what would he say today with over 7 million Jews in Israel, and believing with confidence that once the Geulah, the return collectively of the Jewish people building this incredible country after so many years of suffering, he believed, based in prophecy, that it will be rebuilt and not stopped. That doesn't mean there aren't challenges. It doesn't mean there aren't enormous challenges, but Bezrat Hashem, the renewal of Jewish sovereignty in our era will continue to grow from strength to strength. And I just want to quote one thing. I will talk very briefly about the book that I've had the privilege to write and launch for a few moments at the end. But the second part of the book is based on 4 ideas of Rav Kook, of understanding what the purpose of a Jewish state is and how to unite it. And in the chapter 9, which is entitled Brit, the revolutionary idea of covenant, I try and focus on an idea that Rabbi Sachs and others have written about on the difference between a social contract and a covenant. Most countries come together for self-interest. Politics is, as Ambassador Regev said, about self-interest. But the Jewish people's coalescing as a people cannot be based in self-interest. It's not a social contract. Rav Kook says for all other nations around the world, society is one great insurance company. We all get together to ensure our own survival. It's ultimately driven by collective society to protect individual self-interest. Not so the Jewish people, says Rav Kook, and not so, says Rabbi Sachs. A society should be built on covenant. A covenant, as he defines, is not a contract. It differs in 3 respects, says Rabbi Sachs. It's not limited to specific conditions and circumstances. It is open-ended and long-lasting. It is not based on the idea of 2 individuals, otherwise unconnected, pursuing personal advantage. It's about the we that gives identity to the I. There is a place for contracts, of course, but covenants are prior and more fundamental. They form the matrix of mutuality within which contractual relationships can exist. And 283 times, the Torah and Tanakh speak about Brit. Arguably the most central idea of God's relationship with the Jewish people in the world is Brit. It's a covenant built on far beyond mutual self-interest. And I think it's that Brit and covenant at the heart of Jewish society, which is being tested and challenged, especially in the last 7 or 8 months, that need careful attention. And it's that we'll speak about, I'm sure, in the minutes ahead. And Mizrachi Hashem, as I spoke about in Shul on Shabbat morning, another idea of Rav Kook, how Jewish unity has to be built around 3 pillars of connection to Torah and Jewish identity, connection to nationhood, Am Yisrael, and of course connected to universalism and humanism, a broader vision of the equality of all before the law, and a vision of being a light unto the nations. And that is our great opportunity. And Bezrat Hashem, I believe, from this mashber, and it is a mashber, will arise the mashber, the birth stool, to give for the Jewish people and Jewish society, please God, in the state of Israel, deeper understanding and depth to Bezrat Hashem, the next 75 years of Israel ahead. Bezrat Hashem. Thank you very much.
We'll, as we said, we'll start with the topic of judicial reform and the division that is causing in Israel. What are your thoughts on the legitimacy of the judicial reform, but also on the subsequent unrest that is caused within Israel? On the one hand, the current government rules with a coalition of 64. And it can be argued that the losing political side in the general election does have an obligation to respect the will of the people. Yet we know it is also been claimed that the finer details of a judicial reform were not specified in any coalition agreement. And above all, is it really worth the unrest that it has caused, both in Israel and on the international stage?
I defer first and foremost to the ambassador.
I grew up, I apologize, yes, but I grew up in Habonim. And I have many...
Happens in the best families.
Yes. I have many close friends who every Motzei Shabbat are out there demonstrating against judicial reform. And they firmly, sincerely, honestly believe that this is the beginning and the end of Israeli democracy. And it's not, in my opinion, this or that specific proposal, because the truth is a lot of the proposals were proposed by people who are now in the opposition, people like Gideon Saar, people like Lieberman, right? They are worried about, to use their language, not mine, they talk about a Jewish Khomeinism. Yes, they look at this government and they see people who don't represent what they would argue is traditional Zionist values. They see religious extremism, either the Shas and Aguda type, the Haredi sort of extremism, or they see in the Mizrachi world, they don't see people like Yosef Burg or Zvulun Hammer. They see Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who they think is something very different, something more radical, something maybe more fundamentalist. And there's a big group of Israeli people, right, who live in fear that someone is stealing their Jewish state. Maybe you know people like that. On the other side, you've got people, as you said, Rabbi, very truly, they said, well, look, we won the election. What's democracy all about? Maybe the specifics of judicial reform weren't detailed, but the fact that we wanted a judicial reform, everyone knew that. It was part of the party program. It was part of, not just of the Likud, of the Tzionut Datit as well. It was mentioned, it was said, this is one of the objectives if we gain office. And we got a majority. And democracy, as you said, is about respecting the rights of the minority, but also respecting the rights of the majority. Now, a government was elected with 64 members of Knesset who wanted to push through judicial reform. And there are a lot of very serious people in Israel. If I speak for too long, you told me to shut up, yeah? A lot of very serious people in Israel who believe that judicial reform is long overdue. And they say you're supposed to have the separation of powers. But in Israel, you have a judiciary that reigns supreme over the executive and the legislative branches. And you've got to create a new equilibrium, you've got to create a new relationship between the different branches, because the way the current setup is, according to this view, that you can't have a situation where an unelected judiciary makes all the important decisions and the politicians are irrelevant. And we've got to change the way we choose our judges, and we've got to decide where judges can interfere or not interfere. Now, so far, despite all the talk, the only piece of judicial reform that has been passed into law, and now the Supreme Court will meet next month to decide if it's constitutional or not, and that's very interesting in itself, because the justices have to vote, have to decide if it's the bill that limited their power is now going to them, right? And they will decide if it's constitutional to limit their own power, which is an interesting question, yes? I think from any point of view, right? Can a judge, right? It's a serious constitutional question. A judge has to decide if it's right that the legislative has limited his power. I don't know a lot of people who agree to voluntarily give up their power. Maybe you do, but I don't. But having said that, the only bill that's been passed so far is on the reasonableness bill. The Supreme Court in Israel has been able to rule government decisions and legislation as unconstitutional because it was unreasonable, not because it contradicted another law, but in the eyes of the judges, it was unreasonable. And I think there's a fair discussion that even people who are against the judicial reform is, if something is not illegal but is unreasonable, is that a reason? Because what's reasonable to Mark might be unreasonable to the rabbi and reasonable to Danny Lamb. What's reasonable? It's very subjective, and if it's not based in law, should the justices be able to? Yeah. But here, because I'm speaking at Mizrachi, I'll just say one more thing. If we want to talk about legal reform in Israel, maybe she would also be talking about the Beit Din, or Rabbanim, and how that works. Maybe that's one of the areas where we should be placing a lot of emphasis, because we know what goes, unfortunately, how judges are chosen and so forth, right? There are a lot of issues that Israel needs reform. The current reform, I think Netanyahu, if he was sitting here quietly and talking just to, two people, he'd probably say it's been done wrong, right? What has been done so far? What will happen in the future, I don't know, but I do know this. Close to between just under 2/3 of Israelis, according to polls, support judicial reform with consensus. Will that be possible or not? I don't know.
Thank you, Ambassador. Rabbi Perez, would you like to talk maybe about the impact that it's had on society?
Yeah. I listen very closely to a lot of the people who've been involved in these talks of trying to create some type of consensus. One of them is Micha Goodman. You might know Dr. Micha Goodman, but there are many others. And he says every attempt that has been had ultimately reveals such deep wounds from the right, concerns that the judiciary for so long has itself been overreaching and activist, and not to mention going back to see how slim majorities, both in terms of the Hitnatkut as well as Oslo, bulldozed ahead, and it just brings out so many things. Not to mention the Sephardim and the whole ethnic genie. And then on the left, the concerns, as Ambassador Regev has said, of this is genuinely people on the left feel that this is swapping the tyranny that the right see of the left to the other foot with what de Tocqueville famously has called the tyranny of the majority. It's going to just allow the elected officials to do whatever they want, and that it's fighting for the soul of Israel to the extent of doing the very controversial things of even bringing, as I said, the army and economy into the political fray. So these are some real issues which go very, very deep, and I think it's brought out all types of concerns, of fears from both sides. As Ambassador Regev said, there's no doubt that the vast majority of Israelis believe there has to be some type of judicial change. The shoe has been on the other foot for too long, and as it's just how the way it is, the judges and an army of legal advisors can almost curtail and overrule any and every political initiative, which doesn't often reflect the majority of how Israel votes. And getting this balance right is absolutely critical. And I think the only way one can have long-term changes is in an evolutionary way. Revolutions don't tend to work very well. I think Aaron Barak was very smart. He did a major revolution very quietly in an evolutionary way. I think on the 3rd of January when Yariv Levin announced his revolution, you can't announce revolutions. The French Revolution caused the death of 17,000 people, guillotined. The only way, Rahman al-Islam, to succeed in revolutions is to steamroll and to revolutionize. The Jewish way is what I believe is a revolutionary spirit in an evolutionary way. And there has to be trust and there has to be deep unity for it to be evolutionary and to be sustainable. And I think that's the challenge. I think we know that the current government in Israel is the most right-wing and religious government ever. And I think if one looks objectively, yes, the right-wing and religious won the vote fair and square and have a 64 majority. But every party knows that it's got Bibi right where they want him, and every party's been overreaching. Everyone. If you look at every single party, they're going for broke. The Haredim want to institutionalize in law certain things of, not going to the army in a way that's never been done until now, yet they're a growing demography. So to give the blanket heter, maybe now the army doesn't need them. What about in 20, 30 years' time when it's enshrined in law that they don't have to serve? Secondly, we know that Shas has got billions of shekels for these welfare handouts tailor-made to the size of the families in the Shas community. We know the religious Zionist party has also wanting to legalize every controversial settlement and take part of the Ministry of Defense under Smotrich's control. Ben Gvir wants his own private, police force with extended authority. Now, all these things alone, maybe, you put all that together, and you've got many in Israel very frightened. And on top of that, you say, and guess what, you ain't seen nothing yet. Now we're going to unleash the judicial reform. This has galvanized not only the people on the left who have been, the hard left, who've been campaigning against Bibi for years, the Prime Minister outside our office half the days for years haven't been able to drive out because the black flags have been trying to get Bibi out for years as the Prime Minister. But it wasn't only the hard left, it galvanized so many people. When I see people like Yossi Klein Halevi and Daniel Gordis, who people I deeply respect and read their works, so alarmed and so frightened and so scared and talking in an apocalyptic way that they never have, we have a real issue. And I think the only way to address it is to say, yes, the right has the right to do this, and yes, judicial reform has to be, but we have to do it in a way where it's consensual, in a way that it's got broader acceptance. Otherwise, it ain't looking good.
Thank you. Ambassador Regev, you spoke about what's going on within Israel. Maybe you could explain to us a little bit about the impact that judicial reform is having, over the world, and how it's continuing to impact Israel's relations with Western countries, and particularly the US.
So, I'm a bit of a cynic on this issue. I think if Israel was taking down settlements and moving to establish a Palestinian state, I don't think Joe Biden would have a huge problem with judicial reform. Why do I say such an outrageous thing? Because I saw him just a few months ago meet the Turkish leader and have a very good meeting. And I don't think President Erdogan in Ankara is particularly known for his sticking up for judicial independence. And I saw President Biden meet the Polish Prime Minister. Hugs and kisses. Now, the demonstrators in the streets of Israel who say this is the end of democracy, what do they say? They say, Bibi wants to make us Poland. I think it's politics. And I think Biden doesn't like this government. I think Biden would have preferred that Yair Lapid would have won the election. That's not new. We know that Clinton campaign for Perez against Netanyahu. Not a surprise. We know what it was like with the Obama administration. This is hardball politics. That's what it's all about. You could criticize Netanyahu and say he's given the administration, something to hit him over the head with. He shouldn't have given it to them, right? That's a real politique argument that you can have a serious discussion on that. But to say that he's morally outraged about judicial reform in Israel, that's a bridge too far for Regev.
The Dati Leumi community in Israel is divided not just on the question of judicial reform, but also regarding the political party, Hatzionut Hadatit, the religious Zionist party led by Chaver Knesset Bezalel Smotrich. Looking at some of the statistics from the last election, in some religious Zionist communities, places like Efrat and Alon Shvut, where we were living, fully fledged, Dati Leumi communities, only 48% voted for Hatzionut Hadatit in partnership with Otzma Yehudit. Yet if you look in Nof Ayalon, 68%, in Eli, 75%, Kochav HaShachar, 86% voted for Hatzionut Hadatit. So in your experience, how much does Hatzionut Hadatit really represent Hatzionut Hadatit? And also Rav Perez, I think a lot of people would like to know, World Mizrachi, as the global religious Zionist organization, what is World Mizrachi's position on the party Hatzionut Hadatit?
Thank you for the easy, simple question.
You were warned.
Just to say as follows. The Dati Leumi community in Israel is, like around the world, is not a homogeneous community. It's very heterogeneous. It's very broad. And Dati Leumi representatives are in almost every party. Almost every party. In fact, we're taking a delegation of members of parliament from across the Dati Leumi world, from Yesh Atid through to Tzionut Datit, on a certain trip where we try to work with all of them. So it's not heterogeneous, it's not homogeneous, number one. Number two, I think the religious Zionist world in Israel has become a product of its own success. It's even doubting, does it even need its own party? Meaning, maybe we're so involved in Israeli society that essentially we're involved in all the parties, so maybe you don't even need a party. So you've even got that argument to say we don't need a party. And I think the biggest thing for me which has changed, which relates to both of your questions, is that until 10 years ago, World Mizrachi did have an affiliate political party. 11 years ago it was called Mafdal, the National Religious Party, which changed its name to Beit Yehudi, and then when Naftali Bennett became the head of Beit Yehudi in 2013, he changed its constitution to say Miyesoda Shel HaMafdal, no longer the Mafdal, originally the Mafdal. And at that point, I think World Mizrachi became free politically, for good or for bad. World Mizrachi is no longer, there's no Mafdal, there's no National Religious Party, and even the Jewish Home, which was pretty much the Mafdal and brought together all the different parts of the three different parties. It was Ichud Lomi, it was Beit Yehudi, it was Yamina, and that actually, which became Yamin Chadash, became Yamina, that's basically broken up. And those who follow Israeli politics know that the Tzionut Datit party of today is essentially the National Union, the Ichud Lomi party, Tkuma before, from years ago. So I think the great challenge we have as the national religious movement in Israel, we don't actually have the old Mafdal. There isn't one party which brings together everyone. Not brings together everyone, but like what's called mainstream religious Zionist. And that's a challenge. Now, you talk about Efrat 50% voting for the National Religious Party. It's interesting that so many people that I know, they did a poll before the last election, and they showed that people who voted for the traditional Mafdal voters or voted for the united Beit Yehudi, Yamina, Yamin Chadash, etc., there was now no more Beit Yehudi. So they said 1/3 said they would vote for the Religious Zionist Party, 1/3 for Likud, and 1/3 for either Benny Gantz's party or left. It basically splintered. And that's really what's happened. And I think for Mizrachi, because obviously the Religious Zionist Party of Bezalel Smotrich is more to the, let's call it the right, politically and religiously, of the religious Zionist world. And many people who voted for it, some people because they absolutely believe in it, and other people, they said, well, it's the only religious Zionist party. even though it's the only one which it's gone further to the right. It's the only party in Israel today which once claimed to be a religious Zionist party, even if it's not uniting everyone. Ben Gvir, I must say, is not that. Ben Gvir has never said that Otzma Yehudit is trying to be a religious Zionist party. He has non-religious members. He has about 50%, according to the polls, were not religious. He's specifically not trying to galvanize the religious Zionist world. He's like it's a hard right party which was technically linked in the elections to the Tzionut Datet, but not today, and was never sort of fully ideologically aligned. World Mizrachi, we have a challenge. On the one hand, we are independent, and we want to be a unifying force, and we don't have a formal political affiliation like we had with the Mafdal. On the other hand, and Ambassador Regev will know this more than most, it's hard to operate in Israel if you don't have a political affiliation. The whole thing's built into politics. So we walk a very fine line of working with the establishment and the establishment religious Zionist party, because there's only one which claims to be and wants to be religious Zionist, but at the same time maintaining our independence. So it's a fine line to be unifying and to try capture what the Mafdal spirit was, while at the same time not being oblivious to the fact that there's a system in Israel and you need to know how to work with it while working together without formal official affiliation. And I think that's the great challenge.
I live in the Modi'in area, and I'm sure both of you know better than most. Modi'in attracts a lot of young Anglo-Saxon Olim, many of whom are my neighbors and friends. And there's some people said there's a guy who was the Minister for Religious Affairs in Bennett's government, Matan Kahana, who's a former Sayeret Matkalist, elite combat unit, and then he had enough of being in the commandos, and he became a combat fighter pilot, right? And a very serious man. And he was the Minister for Religious Affairs in Bennett's government. And he tried to do reforms on kashrut, and he tried to do reforms on conversion, and the Haredim went bananas, right? And the minute this government came in, all of his reforms were thrown out. The sort of religious people I see in Modi'in, which maybe tend to be more on the moderate side, and maybe other people are going other places, yeah? But I know people who voted for blue and white, for Benny Gantz, only because Matan Kahana was there. And there's a tzibur there, there's a forum there of people who grew up in Bnei Akiva, yeah? Who went to schools like Yavne, who say, this is religious Zionism, and he's not in a religious Zionist party. He used to be, because he used to be with Bennett, but no longer.
I just wanted to say on that, that's why I was saying, probably a third of those who would have voted for Beit Yehudi have now voted for Benny Gantz's party, because it has people like Chili Tropper, who's religious Zionist. It has people like Matan Kahana, who's religious Zionist. It has Gidon Sa'ar, who is not a card-carrying religious Zionist member, but he's Shomrei Shabbat. He has what they call in Israel the invisible kippah. It also has there's others there as well. And therefore, there are, even though, let's say, Gantz's party is not a religious Zionist party, and neither is the Likud, but both have strong components of religious Zionist representation. That's why I said, I reckon they say, Begadol, a third went religious Zionist party, a third Likud, and a third to Benny Gantz's party.
Jews in the diaspora, always looking towards Israel and wanting to comment and respond to things that they see happening in Eretz HaKodesh. Last month, after the passing of the, depends how you call it, either the Bitul or the Tzimtzum, Chok HaSvirut, the limitation on the reasonability, the reasonableness standard, several Jewish organizations across the world, including in Australia, released public statements expressing concern and criticizing the move. On the one hand, we read on Shabbat, Lo tireh et shoah achicho et seyo nidachim v'italamta mehem. That if somebody sees their brother's affairs, nidachim, going far off, far afield, many feel a sense of duty to get involved. Yet others feel that such statements criticizing Israeli policy on the international stage are really a bit of an own goal in terms of increasing anti-Semitism and the other risks therein. What are your thoughts on Jewish roof bodies in the diaspora making public statements criticizing Israeli foreign or Israeli domestic policy?
Always defer first to the ambassador.
So listen, you can't shut Jews up, right? They're going to say what they want to say, and everyone has an opinion, okay? I wasn't here when Ariel Sharon pulled out of Gaza, but I'm sure there were some people in Mizrachi who weren't happy. Correct, Danny? Yes. Yes? And they probably said that they weren't happy. When I was ambassador in London, I used to say two things, okay? Have your opinions. Everyone can have their opinions. Having an opinion is like being involved, right? You can't love the country and not have an opinion, okay? So everyone's got an opinion. Everyone in this room has an opinion. But I always said, be conscious of two things. Number one, Israel's a democracy and the Israeli people are voting, and at least have some respect of the right of the Israeli people to make their own decisions. And you can't sit here in Melbourne and say, they're all wrong, they don't understand, only I here in Melbourne know what's right for the Israelis. There's something almost, what's the word? It's
Presumptuous, arrogant.
What's the word?
Presumptuous.
Presumptuous, good word, thank you. It's like, a bit of sneot, yeah? You sit here in Melbourne and you know exactly what the Israelis need to do on the Palestinian issue, on religion. You've got all the answers and you sit here in Melbourne. I'm sorry. I used to go to, when I was in London, I'd go to a Reform synagogue to speak. As ambassador, I'd go to all synagogues, but I'd also go to a Reform synagogue, right? And they'd say, what's going on with Reform Jews and why does the rabbinate not go? I said, well, why don't you come to Israel and vote? Orthodox people are making aliyah, why aren't you making aliyah, right? You can have an influence. So there's something presumptuous, right, about someone who sits in the diaspora. Some of them are my friends, and they tell the Israelis, if only you listen to me, everything would be fine. It's presumptuous. The second thing I say to diaspora Jews, and once again, I started by saying everyone's entitled to your opinion and I respect your opinion, and, it's part of caring. But you said it, Rabbi, in your remarks, you've got to be very careful not to play into the hands of Israel's enemies. When I was in England, I can say it now, I'm no longer the ambassador, the British Foreign Office is not traditionally a great friend of Israel, right? It's full of people who used to be called Arabists. I don't know what you call them today because the Arabs are making peace with Israel. But people who were not specifically, in their gut pro-Israel, right? And if a Jewish organization, talks about settlements or something they don't like, who are they helping? In the British political context, they're helping people. So I'm always, if you're going to talk about politics, always think about how your remarks will play and who are you helping? And I think to ask people to think through things. I've made 2 points. One, the presumptuous point, that people should respect the Israeli democratic process and the right of the Israeli people to make. And look, I grew up in Hambonim, I said it before, I'll say it again. Begin was prime minister at the time, wrongly, I admit it now. I weighed on Aliyah and I said, I'm going to vote Begin out of office, right? If you care that much, that you want to do that, make Aliyah and make yourself, right? If you're in the diaspora, I think a bit of presumption. And also think politically about what your comments will affect and how will they play out. And having said both those things, I know Jews will say what they want to say anyway.
I'll just maybe add one small point just on what Ambassador Regev said about the second point about, we don't live in, we live with, we don't live in echo chambers as much as sometimes we do. Whatever we do, people hear. And I think we have to be very careful about, as the ambassador said, about the implications of what we say. I think we've lost something that Ben Gurion used to call mamlachtiyut. It's difficult. If you are a partisan party and you want to express, that's one thing. But if you represent an umbrella body of it's one thing Mizrachi in Melbourne saying something, and even that they're diverse views. But it's an umbrella organization of the religious Zionist institutions. It's not the umbrella organization of Australian Jewry. if you are that, you have to be very, very mindful to try as much as possible to be supportive of the state of Israel and to be very mindful of criticizing the government, especially when it's done in an acerbic way, which I think feeds, the enemy. So, well, look, the Jews themselves say that you're not a democracy anymore and that you're racists and you this and you that and you all of these things. So I think we have to be very mindful of being as broad as possible and not playing into partisan politics.
Thank you. Army service, Sherut Tzvai, is a core part of Israeli society. The sense of duty, but also the sense of privilege after Alpayim Shnot Galut, 2,000 years of exile, to be able to serve in an army is truly a privilege. Many young people, including myself, esteemed members of this panel, made Aliyah Dafka at a younger age in order to be able to serve in the army and thereby integrate as well as to give to Israeli society. And yet, as we know, most Haredim, a large sector of Israeli society, on the whole, do not serve in the IDF. This has become a point of tension over the years, and perhaps even more exacerbated recently by the large Haredi representation in the current government. And whilst the Haredi brothers and sisters share full rights and benefits from the state, most of them do not serve in Sahel. What are your views on the question of Haredim and army service, and what are the possible solutions?
Since this one is less of an ambassadorial nature, maybe it is. I'll just make one or two brief comments. It's true the army today does not need the en masse Haredi conscription. It's true. The question is what's going to be in 10, 20, 30 and 40 years' time. We so often do things to solve short-term problems and we don't think of the long-term consequences. We all know Ezu Chacham, it says in the Gemara, Haro'eh Tanolad. A true Chochem is a person who sees with foresight the Haredi demography is growing in leaps and bounds, Baruch Hashem, in Israel. And therefore, what happens in the coming decades is going to have a deep impact on demography and what happens in Israel. So to give, I think everybody agrees, even many on the left agree that there should be outstanding Torah learners absolved of military responsibility because we need a cadre of every year thousands of top Torah learners. I think there would be national consensus on that. Does that mean that every single person of a particular community should be absolved in law, not only deferred but absolved? And I think that it's not a challenge now, and it may very well be one in the years to come. And it's a challenge. We have to be mindful of that because I think, again, every party is trying to solve its problems for now. But I think there has to be a mindfulness of the long-term mamlachti consequences of such decisions.
My wife once said to me, and sometimes she says things that are very important, she said to me, why are my kids going into the army and your kids who live in Australia are not? We said before about presumptuous, right? Australian Jews sit here, and except for the Chayalim who come on Israel, who I respect, your kids don't go to the army unless they've been in Bnei Akiva and they go on Aliyah and they go in the army, right? So that's a bit of sniut. First point. Second point. I think all Israelis should do the army. That's my moral position. But it's not going to happen. First of all, about 20% of the Israeli population is Israeli Arabs. And except for the Druze and the Cherkessim, how do you say that in English? Caesarean, no, that's how you give birth. I don't remember how, but the Cherkessim do the army service too, but most Israeli Arabs don't. And most of us are pretty happy that they don't, right? There's not a huge, big popular demand. So I think the Haredim are wrong, right? They're wrong on all sorts of things and they're wrong about army service. But in a real political world, it's not going to happen. That's the reality. It goes back to Ben Gurion's decision to give the P'tur when the state was established because he wanted the support of Agudat Israel on the establishment of the state, right? That's the truth. Now, I believe that if you put pressure on the Haredi community, they just circle the wagons, like in the famous Westerns, and they become more internal looking. And I think that's a mistake. You've got to try to influence them with love, you've got to try to influence them with outreach, you've got to try to encourage them to integrate into the state. And I think carrots are better than sticks. As an Israeli, the issue of Haredi not going to the army bothers me. Of course it bothers me. But what bothers me more is the workforce issue. That they're not in the economy. And they're not contributing the same way the rest of the population is. And that's keeping Israel, if you've got 15% of the population who is underrepresented in the workforce, that's a national asset that, I'm poorer, the country's poorer because of that. And I think that's where the focus should be. In all politics, there are a million things I'd like to do, but I've got to say, what are the 10 things that I can do and make a difference? Because if I try to do a million things, I'm not going to get anything done, right? I'd like to see the Haredim in the army, but that's not my priority today. I say this as a secular Israeli. My priority today is, can we get more Haredim into education, workforce education, and get them that they can support themselves and not living off state funding? And unfortunately, the current legal structure is the only way you get a ptor from the army is to be in the yeshiva, and if you go to work, they'll arrest you for being a draft dodger. What's the point? I mean, we understand the logic, but it's counterproductive in the extreme. So if we can make legal changes that maybe encourage Haredim to work and don't arrest them because the minute they get out of the yeshiva, right? I mean, the people who want to study in yeshiva, they study in yeshiva, but there are a lot of people in yeshiva because they're trapped in yeshiva, because if they don't study, they have to go to the army. And so I think there is room for the best, for the country to find solutions that aren't perfect. There's no perfect solutions in this world, right? But to find solutions that can work. And my priority today, encourage Haredim to go to the army. Give them all sorts of carrots to go to the army. The people who do go to the army, especially Chayalim Bodedim, and there are from Australia, I meet them, right? They give them all the carrots. They should get all the encouragement. They should get all the support, right? Because it's a mitzvah. It's the best, right? With the Haredi community, I think the process should be on education and getting them into the workforce, because that's the big issue. That's the big issue. Because as you say correctly, Rabbi, they're going to become a bigger part of the country. Their demography is growing, and that means the less productive part of Israel is going to become bigger, and that's not good for anyone.
I agree wholeheartedly with everything the ambassador said.
Thank you. Thank you.
There's a scholar of Haredi life called Dr. or Professor Neri Horowitz. Have you heard of him? This guy talks exactly like you do. He talks about the need to work with the Haredi community because it will bring positive results. And before I invite a couple of questions from the audience, one of our earlier Olim, by the way, there are plenty of people here whose kids have served in the army.
I said that.
Yep, I just want to stress the point when you go back. Dr. Gary Zettner's son-in-law was an aspiring leader in Sayeret Matkal, and one day his commander came to him and said, "You're being transferred." And he said, "Okay, where am I going?" He said, "You're going to be the head of Nachal Haredi, the Haredi unit." And he said, "I'm not going." So he said, "You've got a choice. You either go or you're dismissed from the army." So he went. And Ron Weiser and I spent some time in the Aza area at some stage, and he was escorting us because he was now the head of that whole area. He said it was the best 3 years in his army life. Every member of that Nachal Haredi unit was a volunteer, and they were tremendously committed. Afterwards, he went with a whole new respect. This is a guy with the gigantic kippah ruga. We're talking a serious Talmud Chacham. So there's lots to learn. A couple of questions from the audience. Gary Hertz.
Ambassador, we know you're a career diplomat, and we've heard you're a good hubbo boy. how does a good Hubble boy work with a good Beitar boy? Was the Hubble boy ever conflicted? And if so, when? And did the Hubble boy ever modify some of his statements when he spoke to the media? And what is the Hubble boy now today?
You're asking a personal question. Yeah, that's all right. Well, the truth is, when I was in high school, I had a girlfriend from Bnei Akiva, so maybe she influenced me, I don't know. But I actually think, first of all, of course, I've changed. I grew up in Habonim, and then other things happened, and so forth and so on. But there's a famous meeting between Ben-Gurion and Jabotinsky in the early 1930s, where they actually make an agreement to work together. And it's called the Ben-Gurion-Jabotinsky deal, right? And then it goes to the Histadrut, and it's voted down by the members, right? But there's no doubt that Ben-Gurion wanted to work. He didn't like the idea that Jabotinsky was out there doing something by himself. He wanted to bring him into the tent, and he thought there was a strong enough national thing. Now, if you know your Israeli political history, as I know this guy does, you know that actually the Likud was founded by Cherut, Liberalim, and a third group called La'am. And the La'am were the Rafi people who refused to go back to labor, and they ended up joining the Likud. And so a lot of these differences are, how did a Habo boy end up working for Netanyahu? By accident. I was in the foreign ministry, and in the foreign ministry it's like being in the army, right? Your job is to represent the elected government of Israel, right? And if you can't accept those rules, then you can't work for the public service, right? If you're working as an Israeli diplomat abroad, your job is to represent the elected government of the state of Israel. And I was doing that for many years, and then they asked me to Olmert. He had a spokesperson for the international media called Miri Eisen. Maybe some of you remember her. She was a colonel in the IDF. She had to leave for personal reasons, and Olmert said you have to bring someone in. And I came in for Olmert's last year, right? And Netanyahu gets elected, and I start cleaning out my desk, right? I thought, because it's a Misrati Mun, it's not a civil service position, the one I had. It's the Prime Minister's choice. The Prime Minister gets to choose his advisors, right? And then I got this phone call during the transition period, and this is how it works in the serious world of politics. I was asked by someone who's now my close friend, but I didn't know at the time, said, Mark, if the Prime Minister-elect asked you to stay, would you? Because they don't want him to ask you to stay, and you say no. That's terrible, right? And I don't know why, maybe because I like the job so much, I agreed and ended up working more than 10 years with Netanyahu. And respect him, and even like him. Not that it's like living with a woman, yes, or with anyone. You see the warts, you see all the faults, but what is a good marriage? That after 40 years you can look at your partner and see all the deficiencies and still love them, correct? So it's not like that between me and Netanyahu, but I've seen him close up, and I can still respect the man, and I see someone who's got greatness, all right? Has he passed it? Should he have resigned? That's a whole separate issue, right? But there's no doubt that he's a serious player, right? And I remember I was working for him in my late 50s, early 60s. And how many people have a job where you learn something new every day, right? And when you're playing at that league of politics, right, it's for someone like me who was always interested in politics. I don't know about Yavna, Danny, but when I was at Mount Scopus doing matric, they didn't offer politics at the school. And I went to Melbourne High in the evening to do politics in matric because I was always a political animal, as the friends who were with me and remember me from my high school years. And so for me, it was like, I also think, that let's be fair. If you look at Israel's success, okay, over the last couple of decades, and there's no doubt that Israel's an amazing success story, right? If we didn't have this judicial reform thing now, everyone, the Israeli economy, the Israeli demographic, Israel's on a positive trajectory. A lot of the recent affluence in Israel is because of the liberal market reforms that Netanyahu pushed through, right? And he deserves respect for that. If Israelis today are going on holidays abroad and are affluent and you see them all over the world, and a lot of that is because of he opened up what used to be a very sort of socialistic system, and he opened it all up. He deserves credit for that.
Thank you very much. I'd like to call on Dr. Michael Kaufman to express a vote of thanks. I didn't express it enough before, but Rav Johnny did. Dr. Michael, will you join us? Dr. Michael has managed the Midrash and has done a fantastic job, so it's a pleasure to call upon her now.
Just very briefly wanted to mention that we have a Midrashah, and we also have not Midrashah who come, and this year we're going to have two girls join us, as well as Bahurei Esder, and we're very, very proud, not only of the work that we do in the Midrashah, but we're also enormously proud of the number of women who come regularly to Shurim and take an active part. So I want to actually say a big thank you to, and I see so many of you here tonight, I really want to thank all of you for your contribution to our Beit Midrash. So thank you. Benji and I are going to give a vote of thanks. I want to start with you, Ambassador Regev. Actually, I want to tell you a secret with all of these people here. I first came across you when I was head of Jewish Studies at Mount Scopus, because one of my students told me my uncle is the ambassador. So, and it was one of the Golvans. So I have kind of been following you ever since, and I want to thank you tonight for your outstanding comments, your insights, your optimism. I certainly know that, saying, we've really walked away feeling that there's a lot of hope, and your insights, your optimism is the mamash medabek. So thank you very much on behalf of everybody here. Rabbi Peretz, I think for me and for everybody here, what you bring to us is in Mizrachi that we belong to something very big. Mizrachi magazine makes us all feel connected. And I know that I've had the privilege of writing a few articles in the magazine as well. And I think that idea that we are connected through your organization to something in Eretz Israel and something so big is such a credit to you. Rabbanit Shani Tarragon has been here. So many people have come through World Mizrachi and have made a difference to our community. And I not only want to, on behalf of everybody here, thank you just for the presentation, but for everything that you do for our community. And once again, your comments, like the ambassadors, has been so meratek and meragesh, and really have uplifted our spirits. So thank you very much.
Good. I know the hour is late, so I'll be quick just to sum up the evening. Thank you all for your attendance here. It's been a wonderful 25th anniversary Beit Midrash and Midrashah event. On behalf of the Mizrachi executive and the committee, I offer my Hakarat HaTov for your ongoing commitment and support towards Torah learning. In his commentary on this week's parasha, Ki Tavo, Rabbi Jonathan Zaks, Zichrono Livracha, emphasizes the centrality of education. He highlights how the commandments to inscribe the Torah on stones reflects the Jewish tradition's understanding of the enduring power of education. He notes that the act of writing the Torah on stones signifies the need for a tangible and lasting embodiment of knowledge. Rabbi Sachs draws a parallel between the inscribed stones and the luchot containing the Aseret HaDibrot. Just as those tablets represented the covenant between Hashem and Bnei Israel, the stones in this parasha symbolize the covenant of education, the commitment to passing down knowledge, values and tradition to the next generation. The commandment to write the Torah on stones teaches us that education is the foundation upon which the Jewish people's continuity is built. Just as the stones were set up in the public place, education should be accessible and visible to all, reminding everyone of their shared heritage and values. And this, I feel, is what the founders of our wonderful Beit Midrash, Midrashah, were thinking all those years ago, when they had the vision to establish a place of learning at 81 Balaclava Road, open for everyone in our community to use. And this, as we all know, has been primarily due to Danny Lamb, and it has been able to continue year after year by taking on the significant fundraising component needed to keep it running. Having just eased out of the Yavna Foundation chair position for over a decade, I know firsthand how challenging fundraising can be. Phone calls get screened, people cross the road when they see you coming closer, and will try hard not to make eye contact with you or engage in conversation. So Danny, on behalf of the Mizrachi organisation, I say thank you and give you the bracha from the famous words we say in the Shabbat Musaf Tefillah, V'chol mish oskim b'tzarchei tibur b'emunah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu yishalem zecharam, serving as a reminder that active involvement in the needs of the community, coupled with faith, is the cornerstone of maintaining a strong, supportive, and spiritually enriching communal environment. Please come up to accept a small gift of our appreciation. Small gift. Which is inscribed, presented to Dr. Danny Lamb AM in recognition of your tireless years of dedication and fundraising towards the Mizrachi Beit Midrash. Thank you, Danny. That brings an end to this evening. However, we will be davening Ma'ariv for those who would like to. Rav Doron Perez will be selling copies of his book for those who would like to purchase it, and signing them as well. Thank you, Danny. And there will be a lovely supper served outside. Thank you for your attendance. Have a good evening.
Just one final thing. Shkoyach Benji, wish you and the new executive of the committee every success. The gifts that our guests received were challah decals made by Monique Tawil, Michelle Tawil, and they have a particularly Australian style. So, nutz Gesundheit.